Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
With us tonight, Polly Mackenzie and Tom Newton-Dunn. Welcome to you both.
Good evening.
Hello.
Starting off with the Times, Brexit, Theresa May. I thought she was on holiday.
Well, she is on holiday. She's
Not much of a holiday.
Well, your Prime Minister, you have a weighty burden to bear, including not getting your holiday. This story is very interesting. It dropped about 4 p.m. today. There was us thinking the Prime Minister was going to be by Lake Garda until past the weekend and popping up mid-next week for a First World War commemoration. And then it emerged that the French President had invited her to his sumptuous summer retreat. None of this checkers business, nice little Buckinghamshire mansion for him. He's got an entire coastal fort on the south coast of France, which is a stunning place. I've clearly never been there. I'd very much like to. Just along the Côte d'Azur there, just down from the Saint-Tropez. So he's invited Theresa May out there on Friday night. Downing Street very keen to make out this was just a routine thing. They've been trying to get together for a very long time. It just so happened that this was the only time their diaries coincided. We don't buy that. This is really quite desperate stakes now. And the reason she's going is quite simply to make a personal and rather desperate plea for Emmanuel Macron to unblock what is yet again another Brexit impasse created by the EU Commission's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, another Frenchman, and there's the clue there, saying he won't stand for Theresa May's checkers plan, in particular the customs union relationship. It really is now getting into the 11th minute or the 59th minute, 11th hour even. There's been a lot of 11 minutes,
again,
11 hours. And if she can't unblock this huge obstacle on the road, which is the French hardline opposition to her Brexit plans, then it is very unclear she has any road left at all to go down.
But positive, though, that he has agreed to this meeting, that it's actually taking place, a sort of unofficial meeting.
It can't do any harm, can it, at this stage? It's funny, if you remember back in the Brexit referendum itself, what we were told by those campaigning for us to leave was that this would be the easiest deal in the world for us to do, that we would just head off to Berlin, head off to Paris, sew up a deal with the leaders of France and Germany, and then the rest of the EU would fall into place. And what's happened over the over the intervening period is that, in fact, the EU has maintained an entirely fixed position and a unified front. We haven't been able to pick off those leaders in the way that we were promised. So Theresa May is now trying to break that kind of fortress Europe approach and she went to see Merkel just a couple of weeks ago. She's off to see Macron to try and persuade them that it's worth kind of breaking ranks in order to change the rules of the EU to recognise Britain. But of course, their view is, why should the European Union change its rules just because we decided to leave?
What do you reckon to her chances of success?
I think she will have slightly more chance of success than people will give her credit for. I don't quite buy Polly's excellent analysis that the EU are rigid and will never change. The EU are 28 different countries, 27 when we leave, and they all have vastly different interests. At the moment, the Franco-German positioning is winning out, which is basically we are going to maintain the integrity of the single market, the customs union, and all our 4 freedom pillars above anything else, and everyone else's interests can go hang. Because that really works for France and Germany most. And France really is the absolute hardline of all the hardliners, not least because, funny old thing, they've also got the most to benefit from Brexit. They get huge amounts of potential highly skilled workers coming back over to France, especially in high finance, a lot of bankers moving over. Interesting, there was a poll recently saying the French people are the only people in the entirety of Europe, including Britain, who want Brexit more than the British. They really are quite happy with this whole concept. So, of course, they want a hard Brexit. Now, Theresa May can work off, I think, some of this with the Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, the more populist governments now in Italy, and really can break down the French. And the French and Germans, who are, of course, still the biggest payers into the EU budget and therefore command the biggest stick, I think their position can be broken down a bit. Now, there's a very interesting line in the Times copy there from an Elysée source telling the Times that Theresa May should not have high expectations of France. And the quote goes, "It is very difficult for Mr Macron," the source said. "It is not in his gift to offer compromises. Only the Commission can do that." Now, there's a chap called Varis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister in the socialist government 3 or 4 years ago when they were having all their Eurozone problems. And Yanis Varoufakis wrote a brilliant book about what it was like to try and negotiate with the EU. And one of his things, and it was called the runaround, they have these ton of different tricks that they play on you that basically makes your negotiation go nowhere at all. And the runaround was fantastic, my favourite of his 6 tricks. I interviewed him about this once. And it was basically, you go and see Angela Merkel, and you say, well, she says, I'd love to do a deal with you, but you've really got to go and see François Hollande in Paris. So you go and see François Hollande in Paris. He says, well, I'd love to do a deal with you, but you've really got to go and see the Commission. Only they can. And you just end up running around all around Europe getting the same pass-on message. And there it is, writ large, the runaround all over again.
The problem is if the buck continues to be passed, we then get to the point where time has run out and it will be a no deal.
And, and we were told, again, weren't we, that no deal is better than a bad deal. But the thing is, that is most true for the European Union because they have something to gain from a disastrous Brexit. We don't gain anything. Europe loses quite a lot, of course, lots of economic turmoil, but they gain something, which is that no one will ever dare to try and leave again. And actually, those populist governments in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, become a kind of a real threat to the European Union's kind of constitutional integrity, which means they have to hold the line. They can't make it look like it's OK to leave. And that puts us in a really difficult situation.
Pour encourager les autres, as they say.
Yeah.
D'accord.
In the end, she capitulates. She's capitulated on absolutely everything. Back in 2016, when she first became the Prime Minister, she promised the hardest of hard Brexits. And now, policy by policy, whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it's the cash, whether it's freedom of movement, the jurisdiction of the European Court, she's basically capitulated and they've learnt the lesson.
That's right.
In this game of chicken,
that's right.
we chicken.
That's a very fair and accurate summation of the last 12 to 18 months. However, all the things she has given away, whether it's money, with the 39 billion, Northern Ireland backstop, whatever, has now been given away. There is nothing left for her to give away in locker because it's my estimation, I think probably a lot of other people's too, that she's pushed the Parliamentary Conservative Party as far as it will go before they defenestrate her, before they just launch a massive civil war with each other. So she can play that card. She can play the card to Macron, who will not want to give anything away because it's massively in France's interest to deliver a very hard Brexit because they gain a whole load of high-skilled workers, a load of the finance industry that the city is a world beater on. But she really can go over there and say, look, I know you don't want to break the EU's fundamental 4 principles for me, and I can see why you wouldn't want to, but you must understand that unless you don't in some way give me something to work with here, then there will be chaos.
But what's
the House of Commons
motivation?
Well, it's simply this. Britain is quite close to falling out of the EU under no deal whatsoever, which would be an extremely disorderly Brexit. It'll be incredibly messy for us. But it will also be very messy for Ireland, who will lose 4% of their GDP overnight, Belgium, the Netherlands. And Theresa May really is extremely weak and not really a person in control of her own destiny anymore. And I think when it comes to it, the EU, I mean, at least a lot of all politicians, right? They all understand the messes that politicians can get themselves into. And they will realise that actually they push the British government as far as they can possibly go. And the British government will implode if they push it any further.
I think they assume that the British government is going to implode because the parliamentary arithmetic is such that there isn't a majority for a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit or Remain. Everyone's completely divided and we're at an impasse. And in fact, I think they're holding out for this growing momentum behind the idea of a vote on what kind of deal we should have in terms of Brexit, because when Parliament can't decide, the only thing to do really is something that I thought would never happen, which is put it back to the people and have a second referendum.
You think that will happen?
I don't see another way forward when Parliament I don't remember the fox hunting votes. There was this whole series of votes. Nobody could decide which way to abolish fox hunting. We had exactly the same thing with the House of Lords. Everyone agreed that we ought to do something about the House of Lords, but nobody could decide what, so we did nothing. And that's what we've got to with Brexit, which is so much more important than any of those previous issues. Parliament can get into a deadlock, and that's where we are.
Well,
can you see a second referendum?
Well, I can. I don't think quite yet, though. I think there is one more thing Parliament can do, which quite frankly has happened all the way through the Brexit process so far, which is fudge. It can delay. It can push it further right. It can delay Article 50 or just buy more time to talk about talks.
There's only so much time that...
No, there's endless time. There is when it comes to the EU, there's endless fudge, there's endless rolling over, there's endless kicking can over, and I don't, we haven't really even begun the fudge. Brexit, as someone once said, in fact, it was Ivan Rogers, the former British ambassador to the EU, said Brexit is a process, it's not a thing. It's not a destination. It's not. Look at Switzerland. So Switzerland has been
Never-ending
rowing with
journey.
the EU for 50 years about it, what sort of setup it has on customs, on single market access. And I think it'll be the same. It will be a rolling negotiation and fudge for an awful long time because simply there is no solid, obvious answer and there is no majority in the House of Commons for it as yet.
And the Sun also has this vow from the Prime Minister. She's clutching at straws for some positive victories to get out of Brexit. So you'll see at the top of the page, UK-only passport lanes vow. She is assuring us that we Brits will have our very own queue with no pesky foreigners in it once Brexit has happened, which is described as a tangible benefit that everyone can see, which suggests she enjoys queuing perhaps more than I do.
An excellent story written by a brilliant journalist who his name passes me away. It is quite interesting in that the Home Office have done a study into whether or not there could be a British-only passport lane after Brexit, because legally we'd be entitled to do that. They've come back to say, well, it'd be incredibly expensive if we did that because we have to have more staff doing different things, and also potentially the queues would be longer in the British lane since most people coming into British airports are indeed British, which would be a bit of a rum-do if you've got the non-Brits having a tiny queue and something going back into the various sort of departure gates for Britain. However, so Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, said, we're not going to do this, we'll just have everyone queuing up together like we do now. Theresa May said, no, we will have our own lanes because it is symbolic and a tangible gesture of Brexit that people can see. The thing about Brexit is it's full of people like me and Polly banging on about the concepts of single markets and customs and everything else. You can't see it, you can't reach out and touch it. It's like it never happened when it does actually happen, if it happens. So the government, Theresa May, is very keen to latch onto these tangible, like a blue passport, which was very controversial as well, like a British-only passport queue in airports that you can actually reach out, touch and say, that is Brexit.
That is Brexit. Oh, for that day to come.
I'm looking forward to it, Julian. I can see you're shivering with excitement.
Something tangible. Let's have a look at the Express. Tough talking.
Well, so the Express is thrilled that she's kind of hardening that line with Macron. Though it's funny because they say that she's talking tough, but in fact she's asking for a sensible Brexit trade deal. So it's not really clear why they're celebrating it quite so much. But nevertheless, I think people who are on that kind of Brexit side of the argument are just desperate for some good news because to all kind of visible evidence, it's a disaster, Brexit, at the moment.
To put a slightly more nuanced take on it, this, I think, comes... We haven't seen the Inside Expresses, but I think this comes from Jeremy Hunt's comments in Paris today, fresh off his diplomatic triumph of Beijing, where he got his wife's nationality wrong, the Chinese. He flew straight to Paris.
He has bought her flowers in Paris, he was tweeting earlier.
Is that all?
Exactly.
And also, if you really want to apologise to your wife, don't do it all over Twitter publicly, and I don't think that worked, personally. But he went to Paris today and said two things. He said, we are careering by mistake towards a no deal at the moment because you're not talking to us anymore. And he has a point in that Theresa May has no wiggle room left in Britain because there is a House of Commons that doesn't like any type of Brexit she's offering up and a Conservative Party that's just about to defenestrate her. So they have a point when they say to the French and the others, be careful how far you push us because you're about to break this very, very soon. But Jeremy Hunt said the other thing he said was, you think by continuing your hard line, eventually Britain's going to blink. Well, that is to fundamentally misread the character of the nation. We aren't going to blink. Now, unfortunately, we have blinked repeatedly throughout this Brexit process. We've given in on money, we've given on Northern Ireland, and the list goes on and on. So, you wouldn't blame the EU to think, well, just one more push and they'll blink again. I think, for the reasons I just said, that would actually be a miscalculation.
We've used up all our time. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Polly Mackenzie and Tom Newton-Dunn. For this section, we're going to kick off with The Guardian, and we've got the Metropolitan Commissioner making some rather interesting comments about drug use and its links to middle-class society. Yeah,
this is a refrain we've heard a few times before, actually, over the last few months. The Met Commissioner Cressida is not the first to say this, but she says in pretty strong language, and this story is carried in a few papers tomorrow, that the cause of much of the street violence that we're seeing on certainly London streets, a lot of the stabbings and horrendous teen violence, is not the violence per se. It's the drugs trade, but it's the fault of middle-class cocaine users at dinner parties. So nice people who might live in North London or even South London taking cocaine while discussing fair trade and various sort of eco-causes, the right-on causes, and thinking there's nothing wrong with passing a bit of cocaine around the table. Well, in fact, it is exactly that cocaine which is fueling this incredible street violence that we're beginning to see on our streets. So the message is to these middle-class do-gooders, stop taking cocaine.
But is the suggestion that they're driving the trade, or they're just, you know...
Well, because the trade is driven
Fueling
by
the supply.
demand, right? There's people with money who it's worth selling cocaine to them. And it's certainly true that I think people who... I obviously go to the wrong kind of dinner parties, but people who do take cocaine or other kinds of drugs need to think about the implications of that. But fundamentally, no effort to control the drugs trade has ever worked anywhere in the world, really. And the only way to take this out of the hands of the criminals is to put it into the hand of much more boring people like pharmacists, and for us to legalise and regulate drugs. And that's the way to stamp out the violence that she's talking about, I think.
I'm in violent agreement with Polly here.
What's happening?
Well, I know. It's the prohibition of any controlled substance around the world has never worked. And it's not just middle-class cocaine users talking about climate change taking coke that is the problem here. It is, you know, as long as there is a demand for cocaine, whether it's in dinner parties or on the streets, and huge amounts of cocaine is used to make crack cocaine, which isn't generally taken in middle-class dinner parties, certainly not the ones I go to, where cocaine isn't taken at all, I should add for the record.
A little bit of backpedalling there. Did we notice that, Polly?
There is demand for drugs everywhere in Britain and all over the world. That demand is nowhere to see. As long as people have got problems and want to get high because of whatever issues they have in their life, there's going to be demand. And therefore, if you decriminalise the whole thing, you strip the entire illegality, the entire criminal element out of drug use and the billions
long
and the violence.
Argument, isn't it?
Yeah,
It is.
and you regulate it and you tax it.
Yeah, we'll keep rumbling on that argument.